Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again, pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look everyone squarely in the eye. I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone and yet to avoid all eyes. I couldn't have guessed what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able utterly to put this fifth guest's shrill metallic urgency out of mind. To a certain temperament, the situation might have been intriguing. My own instinct was to telephone immediately for the police. Needless to say, the horses weren't mentioned again. After dinner, Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body, while, trying to seem pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a series of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker settee. Daisy took her face in her hands as if feeling its lovely shape, and gradually her eyes moved out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be sedative questions about her little girl. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said suddenly, "even if we are cousins. You didn't even come to my wedding. I wasn't back from the war." "That's true." She hesitated. "Well, I've had a very bad time of things. And I've gotten to be terribly pessimistic about everything. And I've gotten pretty cynical about everything." Evidently she had reason to be. I waited for a moment, but she didn't say any more, so I returned rather feebly to the subject of her little girl. "I suppose she talks and eats and everything?" "Oh, yes." She looked at me absently. "Listen, Nick. Let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear?" "Very much. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things." Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where, and I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling. I turned to the nurse right away and asked if it was a boy or a girl. She said it was a girl, and I turned my head away and wept. "All right," I said. "I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow," she went on in a convinced way. "Everybody thinks so, the most advanced people. And I know so. I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything." Her eyes flashed about defiantly, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling scorn. "Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated." The moment her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. As if the whole evening were an elaborate trick to exact a contributory emotion from me. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had asserted her membership into a distinguished secret society to which only she and Tom belonged. Inside, the crimson room ballooned with light. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she was reading aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post, the words murmurous and uninflected running together in a soothing tone. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned the page with a flutter of the slender muscles in her arm. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a raised hand. "To be continued," she said, she said, throwing the magazine on the table, "in our very next issue." Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee. 10 o'clock, she said, evidently finding the time on the ceiling. "Time for this good girl to go to bed." "Jordan's playing in the tournament tomorrow," explained Daisy. "Oh, you're Jordan Baker." I knew now why her face had seemed familiar. Its pleasant, contemptuous expression had gazed out at me from many rotogravure pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Hot Springs and Palm Beach. I'd heard some story of her too. A judgmental, unpleasant story, but what it was I had long since forgotten. "Good night," she said. "Wake me up at 8, won't you? If you'll get up." "I will." "Good night, Mr. Carroway. See you anon." "Of course you will," confirmed Daisy. "In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick, and I'll sort of fling you together. Oh, lock you up in broom closets, push you out to sea in a boat, that sort of thing." "Good night," called Miss Baker from the stairs. "I haven't heard a word." "Nice girl," said Tom after a moment. They oughtn't to let her run around the country this way." "Who oughtn't?" inquired Daisy coldly. "Her family. Her family is one aunt about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to take care of her, aren't you, Nick? She's going to be spending a lot of weekends out here this summer, and I think the home influence will be very good for her." Tom and Daisy sat for a moment in silence. "Is she from New York?" I inquired quickly. "Louisville. Our white girlhood was spent there together. Our beautiful white..." "Did you give Nick a little heart-to-heart on the veranda?" inquired Tom suddenly. "Did I?" Daisy looked at me. "Can't seem to remember, but I think we talked about the Nordic race." "Yes. First, it sort of crept up on us, and first thing you know..." "Don't believe everything you hear, Nick," Tom advised me. I said lightly that I hadn't heard anything at all, and a few minutes later got up to go home. They followed me to the door and stood in a cheery square patch of light. A square patch of cheery light. As I started my motor, Daisy peremptorily called, "Wait! I forgot to ask you something, and it's important. We heard you were engaged to a girl out west." "Yes," confirmed Tom. "We heard you were engaged." "It's a libel. I'm too poor." "But we heard it," insisted Daisy, surprising me by opening up in a flower-like way. "We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true." Of course I knew what they were referring to. The fact that gossip had published the banns was one of the reasons I'd come east. You can't stop going out with an old friend because of rumors, but on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored into marriage. Their interest rather touched me, and made them seem less remotely rich. Nevertheless, as I drove away, I felt uneasy and a little discomforted. It seemed to me the thing to do was for Daisy to rush from the house, child in our arms. But apparently there were no such intentions in her head. As for Tom, the fact that he had some woman was rather less surprising than the fact that he'd been depressed by a book. Something was causing him to nibble at the edge of stale ideas, as if his sturdy physical egotism no longer nourished his peremptory heart. Already it was deep into summer on roadhouse roofs and wayside garages where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light. When I arrived at my estate at West Egg, I rolled the car under its shed and sat for a while on an abandoned lawn roller. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night, with wings beating in the trees and a persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered across the moonlight, and, turning my head to watch it, I saw that I was not alone. The figure of a man had emerged. A figure, 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion with his hands in his pockets, regarding the silver pepper of the stars. Something in his leisurely movements and the secure position of his feet upon the lawn suggested that it was Mr. Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. I decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction, but I did not call to him, for he gave the sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He thrust his arms out seaward, in a strange gesture. He thrust his arms out seaward, and as far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was shaking. Involuntarily, he thrust his arms out towards the dark water, and far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was shaking. Involuntarily, I turned my head seaward and distinguished nothing, except a single green light, diminutive, minute and far away. A single green light, minute and far away, that could have been the end of a dock. When I looked back for Gatsby once more, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. Chapter 2. About halfway between New York and West Egg, the motor road hastily joins the railroad for about a quarter of a mile, so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is the Valley of Ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with transcendent effort, of ash-gray men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally, a line of gray cars crawls along an invisible track, gives out a ghastly groan, and comes to rest, and immediately the ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud which screens their obscure operation from your sight. But above the gray land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive after a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. The retinas are 1 yard high, and they look out of no face, but instead out of a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently, some wild wag of an oculist had set them there to fatten his practice in the Borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or else had forgotten them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let the barges through, passengers in the waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for up to half an hour. There is always a halt here of at least a minute, and it is because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he strolled into popular cafes with her and, leaving her at a table, sauntered about, chatting with whomsoever he knew. I had no desire to meet her, though I was curious to see her. I had no desire to meet her, but I did. I was taking the train with Tom up to New York one afternoon, and when we stopped at the Valley of Ashes, he leapt up and, taking me by the elbow, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he insisted. "I want you to meet my girl." I think he'd tanked up a good deal at luncheon, and his determination to have my company bordered on violence. I followed him over a whitewashed railroad fence and back along the road for 100 yards or so under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent stare. The only building in sight was a small square of yellow brick sitting on the edge of the wasteland, a sort of compact main street ministering to it and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the 3 shops it contained was for rent, and another was an all-night restaurant approached by a trail of ashes, and the third was a garage, repairs, George B. Wilson, cars bought and sold, and I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford that crouched dimly in a corner. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself emerged from an office door, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. A damp gleam of hope leapt into his light blue. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope leapt into his light blue eyes. "How you doing, Wilson, old man?" Tom said jovially, slapping him on the shoulder. "How's business?" "I can't complain," said Wilson unconvincingly. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Soon," said Tom. "I've got my man working on it now." "Works pretty slow, don't he?" "No," said Tom coldly. "And if you feel that way about it, maybe I better sell it somewhere else after all." "I didn't mean that. It's just..." His voice faded off. Tom glanced around the garage impatiently. Then the thickish figure of a woman emerged from the office door. She was in her middle 30s, faintly stout. She was in her middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her flesh sensuously as some women can. Her dress, her face, above a dress of blue spotted crepuscine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as though the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. She walked. She smiled, and walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, and shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye, shook hands with Tom. She wet her lips, and without turning, said to her husband in a low, coarse voice, "Get some chairs, why don't you, so somebody can sit down." "Oh, sure," said Wilson. And he went off towards the office door, mingling immediately with the cement color of the wall. A white ashen dust veiled everything. A white ashen dust veiled his suit and his hair just as it veiled everything in the vicinity except his wife, who moved close to Tom. "I want to see you," he said.